Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I'd like to discuss the news that the Conservatives privately recognise the very serious situation they're in, despite the public show of bravado. They've gone from a strategy of pumping extra resources into their 80 most vulnerable seats to 200. But is even that enough? So, there was a funny Spectator article published at the weekend. I've only been able to read the first couple of paragraphs. I don't have a subscription. I have a lot of subscriptions to news media in this country and others so that I can see what's been written, but I have to draw the line somewhere. But the article begins at least by noting that 2 weeks ago, people were saying that Sunak had his best ever week. They're looking at the situation now and asking what happened. I mean, I could point out that those who thought Sunak had a good week a fortnight ago were deluding themselves. He didn't have a good week. He had a noisy week. It's not the same thing. He went out, made lots of noise, gave lots of speeches, but the polls remained as they were. The scandals kept coming. The week ended with a defection to Labour. Those who squint their eyes and look for signs of progress uncritically for the party they favour are absolutely doomed to have to wonder what went wrong shortly afterwards. And now we're getting articles about the Conservatives' change of strategy for the election. They were on an 80-20 strategy. It was always mad. This is where you pump extra resources into your 80 most vulnerable seats. And then 20 seats that you didn't win last time, but you think you've got a chance of taking. But however you slice it, that means special consideration for just 100 seats. Now, The Guardian are reporting on the quiet that the Conservatives are pumping extra resources into as many as 200 constituencies now. Journalists and analysts alike are pointing out that some of these seats have huge majorities, although that isn't really the case. The Tories did especially well in 2019 over the single issue election of Brexit, but also Labour falling back badly. They got their presentation incredibly wrong. The majorities won in 2019 aren't real. Just as many of the majorities that Labour will win this year won't be real either. The consequence of a ruthless campaign in this case, after 14 years in opposition, and the party of government getting almost everything childishly wrong. But although when you read the Conservatives will now be pumping extra resources into 200 seats, and that makes it sound like they're taking the situation seriously, that they don't believe they're hung parliament nonsense. But what does that actually mean? Because at the last general election, the Conservatives won 365 seats. There are currently 344 Conservative MPs, so they've already lost 21. Actually, technically 22, because they won Hartlepool, so that sort of bunged it up to 366. Pretty well, in theory. But some are the result of the sitting MP having lost the party whip. Others were the result of by-election losses, but in safe seats. So under normal circumstances, the Conservatives would have expected to win most of those seats back at the general election. So they still have to count them as their seats. So we should really consider that the Conservatives are defending, so we don't muddy the waters too much. Let us just say the 365 seats they won in 2019. If they are thinking that up to 200 seats are vulnerable and therefore in need of extra resources, they're saying that they believe that 165 seats are safe. But how many seats can actually be deemed safe? Well, let's look at current polling. Of the polling companies that I take seriously, in other words, the ones who've been doing it for a while, the ones that are kindest to the Conservatives, that's probably Savanta, and the harshest is probably YouGov. Savanta conducted a poll last month. The Conservatives on that would win 132 seats. So immediately this poll says that the Conservatives would lose 233 seats compared with their 2019 result. And consider that some of the 132 that they would win would be by narrow margins. So they're still vulnerable. Several dozen of those would still be vulnerable. It's just that they think on the balance of probability based on the polling now, they'd just sneak it. So only pumping extra resources into 200 seats would mean abandoning a good 60 or more seats. And that's one of the kinder polls. There are other ones that are sort of on the same level, like opinion and stuff like that. But that's sort of what we're looking at. The Tories would be basically abandoning a good 60 or more seats. Then if we go to the other end of the spectrum, the YouGov poll, the most recent one, would mean the Conservatives would lose quite a lot, over 300 seats, with most of the rest being very close. So only pumping extra resources into 200 seats means abandoning probably about 150 seats. And even if the Conservatives think that realistically the true picture is somewhere between YouGov and Savanta, stroke opinion, only bolstering 200 constituencies still means you must be abandoning about 100 seats. The question is, which 100? They might be abandoning the 100 most vulnerable seats as being a fundamental waste of money to try to retain because they've got no chance at all. The problem with this is that MPs and local Conservative groups know whether they're getting extra resources or not, and the most vulnerable will know who they are as well. Like Jonathan Gullis, for example, would be amongst this number. I'm sure the 100 most doomed seats would realise they were being abandoned if this were the case and kick up a stink. So the safest would probably be to abandon the 100 vulnerable seats on the other end. Convince those MPs and local Conservative groups that actually they're not as vulnerable as they may imagine. But the problem with this is then you're not pumping extra resources into seats which are vulnerable but also winnable. Those which are under assault from Labour or the Lib Dems, but which, you give them some extra muscle, that could make the difference. Neither of these options sounds like a good plan. Abandon your most doomed seats. That is surely the best strategy for limiting the damage at the election, but then you destabilise the party in the meantime. Leave seats at the safer end of vulnerable without extra resources, and you might maintain stability of the party and something of an optimistic outlook, but you make it more likely that the results will be especially bad at the election. And yet it's not like the Conservatives can just pump extra resources into every genuinely vulnerable seat, because that's most of them, way more than 200. And it's because there's not only spending limits. Doesn't matter how much money the Conservatives raise, there are spending limits. But it's not just about the money. When they say resources, they mean that. It means strategists to work with the local groups, nailing down the key messages which will work in that area. They've only got so many strategists they can employ. It means bussing in activists from safer nearby constituencies to get more volunteers on the doorstep. But when everyone's up against it, that doesn't seem feasible either. There's a limit to how many seats the Conservatives can realistically bolster with extra resources. Frankly, 200 sounds like a stretch. And yet the number of vulnerable seats is way more than that. I suspect what the Conservatives would do is risk the safer end, if I'm honest. So I spent some time thinking about what I would do if I were in charge of this aspect of a campaign for a party I wanted to do well. And it's simply impossible to throw heightened resources at almost every one of the 365 seats you won at the last election. You can afford to abandon the most vulnerable seats already lost because there's no MPs there. So like Blackpool South, for example, which was just lost to Labour. There's no longer a Tory MP there, so they're not going to cause you any trouble if you say, yeah, we're not getting any resources. So you can whittle down that 365 number by binning the ones you've already lost, but that were never safe, so you can't win them back. You may then have to consider that, as I say, the Conservatives did win Hartlepool in a by-election. There's an existing MP there, so that moves the dial one way, one the other way. But that won't change the numbers that much. I would then consider that although it would be best for the party to abandon several dozen more doomed seats, the current MPs would be able to cause trouble. They could threaten confidence letters if that happened. So you've probably got to give them the extra resources, even though it's a waste of money. So I think I would risk the safer end of the vulnerable seats and hope that the national campaign bolstered them without the need for the extra resources being given to them individually. And that would be much in line with how I see Conservative strategy at the moment anyway. We've passed the point of choosing a strategically sensible time to hold the election. The best time for Sunak was actually last May, not the one just gone, last May. It's gotten worse since then. It's gotten provably worse since then. The Tories are now in a state of hope. They're hoping that the Rwanda plan somehow wins them some support. It won't. It's more likely to lose them even more support when it fails. They're hoping that falling interest rates will make people feel better. They won't. How could they? They are a party putting their faith in the arrival of a miracle. So it would make sense to dump extra resources into their most vulnerable seats even if that includes a lot of seats that are definitely doomed, and abandon many of the ones already lost, of course, even if some would be winnable under normal circumstances, and then also leave out the less vulnerable in the hope that circumstances and their national campaign are enough. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. If you enjoyed the video, please subscribe for further content and click the like button. You can also sign up for memberships if you'd like to support the channel further. Thanks for watching, and until next time, I'll see you later.